Bong Wajin Yujin Yudan Song Pema Gaza Dambola Yazan Jigin Hundum Ni Pema Jinji Zidang Kutu Kadoma Poko Jiji Jizu Dubji Jinji Lobji Jizu Guru Pema Sidi Hong Hong Ojin Yudin Yudan Song Pema Gaza Dambola Yazan Jigin Hundum Ni Pema Jinji Jizu Dang Kutu Kadoma Poko Jiji Jizu Dubji Jinji Lobji Jizu Guru Pema Sidi Hong Hong Ojin Yudin Yudan Song Pema Gaza Dongola, Yazan Jugi Nedubni, Pema Jini Jizu Drang, Kadu Kado Maboko, Jidi Tizu Tabji, Jinji Lobji Jizu, Guru Pema Sidi Hong, Om Ahung Benza Guru Pema Sidi Hong, Om Ahung Benza Guru Pema Sidi Hong, Om Ahung Benza Guru Pema Sidi Hong. Toshale, warm greetings, I'm Dragpa. Hope you're doing super well. We arouse our motivation of wisdom and compassion, like really with the heartfelt aspiration that just taking this brief little moment of time, that this becomes the perfect auspicious conditions to support everyone's natural goodness, their basic goodness, the Buddha nature to just shine brightly, unobstructedly, fully. That all beings have happiness as a result, and they're free from all suffering, and that the enlightenment, that Buddha nature shining on unobstructedly, enlightenment is achieved right now. Thanks. Just offering some brief reflections on whether it's possible or not to live without story. Is it possible for us to live without story? I think the short answer is no. As duality beings, definitely not. We are human beings, the human being duality beings. We're like story-making monkeys, right? We're like our SEM or duality consciousness, its kind of function is to constantly string together present moment experiences into narratives, into stories, into patterns. It's like a pattern locator. It's of all the different patterns of like an instant of sight, an instant of sound, an instant of sight, an instant of smell. Like these are all present moment activities. And this sixth consciousness of duality mind or SEM is what kind of comes into the experience and strings them all together, like sees patterns or creates patterns between them. And this is called a story, a narrative, a sense of meaning, purpose, a worldview, a view. So as duality beings, there's all kinds of views, Buddhist ones and non-Buddhist ones, all kinds of stories. Is it possible to live without stories for duality beings? Definitely not. For wisdom beings or beings not trapped by duality, I'd say it's very possible to live without stories because they don't have SEM or duality mind. So what do they have instead of duality mind? They have wisdom awareness, non-dual wisdom, non-duality wisdom awareness that sees all the patterns, all the stories, all the ways of connecting the dots. It's a perfectly accurate mirror that reflects without distortion every single experience, movement arising in the vast frameless mirror of awareness, of wisdom awareness. So for wisdom beings, non-duality beings, they're no longer trapped by believing in any story as being real. It's the only story, the real story, the bedrock story, the main story. They're not trapped with this mistaken belief anymore. Is it possible for such wisdom beings to live without pattern? No. Like, how do we know this? I'm a duality being. How could I say that? Because Buddha always taught there's relative and absolute truth in union. There's always the openness and the expressive quality of that openness. There's always like formless, semi-form, and form. Like the nature of formlessness is to arise as form. The nature of form is formlessness, spaciousness, openness, indescribability, inconceivability, inexhaustibility, beyond conception, beyond the limitations of duality framing, not able to be held within that box. Wisdom cannot be held within any single or set of story. It goes out of the box, out of any box of any kind of story making. This is what wisdom does. What does it mean to go out of any box? It means it can seamlessly be in every box. It doesn't mean boxless. It means flexible with every story, with every pattern. There's always pattern. There's always relational. There's always relative truth. There's always form. So for wisdom beings, it's called pure form. How form, how stories, how patterns arise when they're not filtered through the distortive filtering of duality fixation. Called pure story, pure relative truth, pure body and pure speech. Then for duality beings, sentient beings, wandering human beings, constantly in search of finding lasting happiness, do we have the option to have story? It's not an option. That's just how we function. Sem, duality mind, is like a definitive feature of sentience, of sentient beings, of wandering beings, drowa. We have a story, and the story always orients towards something, and it always excludes something. So we always have this wondering sense of me going somewhere, needing something. This is not enough as it is right now. My awareness is not enough as it is right now. I need to do something, express something, share something, connect with something. It focuses on the thing. So the function of duality mind is always to like focus on the object of the thing, and oftentimes to forget about like how I'm narrating what the thing is. How do I see the thing? And so Buddhism techniques are all about going to this mind, this observer, the knower, the awareness, to look at how powerful that mind is, that awareness, the narrator, the director, the story maker, the myth maker, the sense of me, to really look at that subjective awareness, and to see, can that make better stories? Can this awareness make better stories? And so here, what's the definition of a better story? Because better means there's worse and there's better. There's good stories and bad stories, right stories and wrong stories. Then what does that mean? If such a wisdom being can elegantly move between any story without any preference, without fixating or holding anything as really truly existent, a fixed story, they don't do that. So how could you make a distinction between a good story and a bad story? And that's what story helps us see recognize our wisdom awareness, our capacity to move elegantly between and within stories. That would be called a good story. Good for who? Good for whatever story is being assumed. Good for whoever is narrating the current story. Whoever, me, this being, this mind, whatever story I'm in right this moment, whatever helps me to include more pattern, more truth, more accurately, more elegantly, more flexibly, to move between more story making, more meaning making, more sense making, not just more as a quantity, but as a quality, as like the way to not fixate on story as being a final, definitive, permanent truth. That's called a good story for that mind at that moment. So good and bad is always context sensitive. It always depends on the story that's currently running. It depends on the movie that we're in. It depends on the logic we're assuming. Depends on the patterns we're working with. Depends on the computation structure, the set of assumptions that is defining the rule set, that's defining what story am I in? How does this work? What does it orient towards? What are the values? What are the goals? What are the objectives? How can it be optimized? These are all the rules or the patterns, the trajectories, the melodies, whichever kind of example we want to use. They're what define the contours, the shape of the form of the story, of its arc. Is it cyclical? Is it linear? Is it non-linear? Is it multi-pathway? Is it quiet story? Is it music story, sound story, space story? What kind of a story or world is it? What kind of a landscape is it? And so once we define what is the world I'm in, what is the story I'm telling myself, what is the story I'm co-making with others, then we have the container, the world, where we can all of a sudden define what's a good story and a bad story. What helps us recognize our wisdom awareness? This capacity to not unrealistically lock into story framing Instead, to like see what story is happening here, how can it open into more wisdom and more compassion? How can it become a better story? And this is part of the function of Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana teachings, to use duality, to go beyond the limitations of duality, to use form, to relate to form, to work with form, body and speech, in order to open the fullness of the expression of that form, of body and speech, of, to really see the fullness, the richness, the interconnectivity or the interdependence of body, speech, and mind. So we include both the bad stories, the good stories, and go beyond stories. Bad duality, good duality, and non-dual or beyond duality, wisdom. Like a wisdom being, a noble being, they can include the full spectrum of all this experience, and they don't believe any of it as finally, permanently, definitively true. They no longer hold on to have the need, the impulse, the kind of like fear that there has to be one story that's true, one way that's true. And so I just was able to watch a teaching by Dzogchen Rinpoche that they just recently gave in Bhutan on how to practice on Guru Rinpoche. And a big part of this teaching that he was giving in Bhutan, mainly to Bhutanese people, it seemed like, was on the power of this function of symbolism, of representation. That the nature of mind, that our wisdom awareness is the absolute Guru Rinpoche, that it is already completely, it's Buddha nature. And in a Tantra version, it's Buddha nature expressing as Guru Rinpoche in the variety of ways Guru Rinpoche can be. But it's this nature of mind is absolute Guru Rinpoche. But for most of us wandering duality beings that constantly kind of need entertainment, that's not an interesting enough story. It's not entertaining enough. Just to say your mind is Guru Rinpoche. And I don't trust that my mind's Guru Rinpoche. I have all these bad habits. I have all this suffering. I'm wandering. I'm fixating on objects. I'm constantly not satisfied. Nothing's never enough. How can I be Guru Rinpoche? So I doubt that. And so all of a sudden, kind of, we need this kind of entertainment, these ways of connecting to or seeing more clearly our inner kind of wealth, our inner treasure, this nature of our mind. Our nature of mind, of body, of speech is Guru Rinpoche already. This is called symbol, or representation, or story. What's a good story? A story that points out our absolute Guru Rinpoche of ourselves and of each other. This shows the Buddha nature within all beings, and the pure kind of essential Guru Rinpoche that is all arising experience, the nature of all experience. And so then we get, what is Guru Rinpoche? How is Guru Rinpoche? It's just kind of unbelievable to duality mind, like a small box story making. Guru Rinpoche can, how was he born? In a variety of ways. He was born as an 8-year-old boy on the pist of a lotus, surrounded by 100 dakinis, spontaneously in a non-coordinated way, like exactly singing the 7-line prayer of Guru Rinpoche spontaneously. Or some Dharma teachings say he was just born from a woman, like as the kind of normal human way. How many emanations did Guru Rinpoche have? It's endless. If it's helpful to have the story of one, then that story is told, or 8, that story is told. 108, one in each of the 6 realms, countless, unfathomable. Then these are all stories, and they're all symbols, they're all representations. And what is the purpose? To help us recognize absolute Guru Rinpoche. Why? So that we can wildly, courageously, carefully embrace all the different expressions of Guru Rinpoche. The vast, boundless expanse of story making, of stories, of patterns, of the pure story making. Pure, meaning not filtered through the habits of fixating on any one story as being right, the only way, but just what story is helpful in now, in this set, in this context, according to this logic, in this culture, in this body, in this place, at this land, with this history. Like, locate the contours of the world. What helps that world be more inclusive, more comprehensive, more loving, more compassionate, more wise? To have Buddha nature of the world, its beings, shine more clearly, more purely, more unobstructed by duality mind fixating on one story as being real. Only this set of symbols is true. Only this way of representing is true. This is a mistaken way of holding on to relative experience, according to the Buddhist teaching. It's always context sensitive. What story is helpful or good in this context, in my mind, in my heart, in my body, with others. According to what? To recognize absolute Guru Rinpoche, the absolute nature of my mind, or the how patterns arise when they're not funneled through any kind of a fixating mechanism, but how these patterns arise purely, naturally, spontaneously, all the time, without limit. So can we live without stories as duality beings? That's kind of the habitual way we always orient through narrations, is duality consciousness. Do wisdom beings work that way? No. They work through wisdom. Wisdom and compassion in union. They see the union of relative and absolute truths. What does that mean? That means they can engage any story skillfully, helpfully. They can use any symbol, any pattern that's helpful. And what does that mean? It means it has to be helpful for the being that they're relating to. So if they're relating to a baby, they like tune their story to auto-fit to the baby's story making. If they're relating to any kind of a being, a squirrel, then these noble ones will tune the story making exactly to the logic, the language, the culture of the squirrel in the most helpful way possible for that squirrel to recognize its Buddha nature, or to have a connection to some supportive secondary conditions that'll help that realization, that direct recognition, the squirrel seeing its own nature, be more easily available for the squirrel. It's called skillful means, the outreach and compassionate activity of the noble wisdom beings. But they no longer believe in this story, so it's not really true to say wisdom beings have to use story, but they do recognize pattern elegantly, perfectly. These are called the 5 wisdoms. It's perfect pattern recognition without excluding anything. They perfectly reflect everything. They see the relationality between the reflections. They don't exaggerate or deprecate any of them. They like see that they're all infinitely inexhaustible. They're all fully intact, perfectly there, already accomplished. There's no favorites amongst the reflections. They all have the same equal nature of being absolute, like having absolute emptiness nature. This 5 wisdom capacity. It's not just that it's open, spacious mind. Wisdom awareness has these 5 wisdoms, which then can be subdivided into 25 wisdoms. Each of the wisdoms has 5 subparts. The 5 wisdoms enfold into each other. What does that mean? It's just more complex, nuanced stories, more complex, nuanced patterns that these noble beings can relate to. It's like more instruments to be able to play, to sync up in like really elegant, harmonious, lovely, moving, inspiring ways to make these beautiful symphonies that can sweep us away into our Buddha nature and the Buddha nature of others, to have a longing to have our Buddha nature shine on fully 100%. And to really, with this longing, to have this creative impulse, this energy, this effort to let's enjoy this. Let's kind of really enjoy the music, enjoy the pattern, enjoy the beauty of all the fascinating stories, but without forgetting the purpose of the stories. This absolute Guru Rinpoche is the nature of mind, is the nature of every story, its absolute nature. So it's always this balance between the relative and the absolute. Duality beings, relatively, we believe falsely that stories our story making is the only right way. If we kind of have a more refined, accurate experience of that duality mind, then we start using duality to make duality more accurate. We refine duality. And that leads us towards it leads us towards wisdom, the very source of all duality. Wisdom is like kind of this absolute kind of source, or this nature, the base, the ground of all duality is this wisdom awareness, this wisdom heart mind. So good story, right story, helpful story always orients anyone, the story maker, the meaning maker, to see that absolute, unrestricted, perfectly, amazingly, infinitely creative capacity of Buddha nature, of the awareness to make and elegantly be within any story, any representation, any symbol that's helpful at any scale, at any time. Small stories, medium stories, big stories. Work with a baby, work with an adolescent, work with an adult, work with a Buddhist, work with a non-Buddhist, work with a human, work with a non-human. These noble beings don't have preferences of this. They see the Buddha nature of all these beings, and they're willing to engage with the story pattern making of any of them. Why? Because the nature of each of those beings is Buddha nature, the nature of enlightenment. And because of that, then the beings are just joyfully willing and capable and powerfully kind of like energized to relate to any kind of story making that exists, and how whatever's available in the most helpful way possible, whatever's skillful for that story making, to auto enhance or auto poetically like expand itself into even greater love, greater wisdom, greater compassion. That's just a brief reflection on the power of story making, the inevitability of making stories if we're sentient beings, and like how we can more skillfully use story making to have better story making, so that we can like actually elegantly be with other beings' stories in the most skillful, helpful ways possible, so that we can mutually honor and appreciate kind of this natural goodness and intelligence that we all have. Thanks, friend. Just a quiet little thought. Great. Awesome. By this merit may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara may I free all beings. Precious bodhicitta, and those without it may it be generated, and those who have it may it never diminish, but always continue increasing. Deity, mantra, and dharmakaya are the nature of appearance, sound, and awareness, the pervasive kaya and wisdom display of the Buddhas. May practitioners of the profound and secret great perfection remain inseparable from the innermost one-taste awareness of wisdom mind. So we can wake up from the dream, but we can never end the dream. It always keeps moving. There's always relational relative truth. Are we going to make this a good dream for ourselves and others, for all beings? The most fun, amazing, supportive, uplifting dream possible, and at the same time recognize it's just a dream, so we can lighten up and enjoy it. Thanks.